Carol Wheeler. Good evening and welcome to the City of Rochester's Home Investment Partnership American Rescue Plan, ARP, public input meeting. My name is Carol Wheeler, Manager of Housing, and I am happy you are participating with us tonight. I am joined by several of my colleagues from the Department of Neighborhood and Business Development, Linda Hedden, Associate Administrative Analyst, John Oster, Senior Community Housing Planner, Rita Roshka, Community Development Block Grant Coordinator, and Henry Fitz, Grants Management and Research Coordinator. We are hopeful that Eric Frisch, our Deputy Commissioner, may also be joining us a little later. The city has received a federal allocation of $8.9 million in HOME-ARP funding. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to help support our most vulnerable populations to become stable in permanent housing. As we plan for these funds, I admonish you to please keep in mind this is a one-time infusion of resources, and how do we best utilize these funds for maximum and lasting benefit? At this time, I will turn it over to John Oster, who will be giving the presentation this evening. Again, thank you for participating, and we look forward to your comments. John?
Sorry, folks, it looks like we're having some technical difficulties. I think John is going to come back into the meeting momentarily.
Hi, everybody. Sorry about that. I seem to have dropped my signal, but back in now. Carol, thank you for the introduction. My name is John Oster. As Carol mentioned, I am a senior community housing planner for the city of Rochester. I'm going to be going over some of the information for the HOME-ARP funding allocation plan today, the draft plan. And I wanted to thank you all for coming out, for giving us feedback, and for participating. This may take me a second to get the screen share right, but thank you for your patience. Okay. All right. If the slides look off, somebody from the city tell me, otherwise I'm going to keep going. So again, thank you everybody for attending today. This is the City of Rochester, as we mentioned, the Home Investment Partnership, ARP public input meeting. Today is April 20th, 2022, just for record keeping purposes. Quickly, we're going to go through the agenda for today's meeting, and then just kind of some, I guess, general guidelines for you guys giving us feedback, which we want to make sure we record and we're able to process. So firstly, the agenda. The first thing we're going to discuss is just some background information on HOME-ARP. We're going to talk about the HOME-ARP funding allocation plan timeline. Next, we're going to discuss the planning and outreach overview. After that, we're going to talk specifically about HOME-ARP. It's a little bit different than traditional home funding, and we wanted to highlight kind of the specific areas that were different and that were, we think most important. And that includes the qualifying populations, the eligible activities, and then the city's draft HOME-ARP funding allocation plan. At the end, we will have a question and comments section. We definitely welcome your feedback. So before we start, we're going to try and get through this relatively quickly. We know we want to spend some time answering questions, but there's some material we think is important to go through with everybody. So throughout the presentation, you are welcome to submit a comment or a question at any point. We encourage you, and in fact, we request that all of you actually enter any questions or comments in the Q&A box. There are really two ways to enter comments and questions. There's a chat box and there's a Q&A box. We think the chat box is disabled, but just please make sure that you're entering questions and comments in the Q&A box. And that'll make it so that we can, check in on those after the fact. We can print those, we can incorporate them into the plan, which we think is really important. And we want to make sure we have a accurate record of, what's discussed here today. So again, answer questions. You can ask questions or enter comments into the Q&A box at any time. We may answer those throughout the presentation in the actual Q&A box, that tool itself, or some we may hold till the end of the presentation if we think it requires a little bit more time or would be better answered verbally. So again, we're going to document all questions and comments, and we're going to try and find ways to incorporate those into the final plans. We've received some great comments already that have helped us kind of shape some of what we're doing, and we hope that continues. So moving on to the actual presentation. Thank you all again. So a little bit of background on HOME-ARP. Annually, the city receives about $12 million in HUD funding, and about $2.5 million of that is home funding. That's annually. We get an allocation from HUD. We aren't ever sure exactly where it's going to be, but we can usually estimate it. So as you can see, this HOME-ARP funding is a pretty significant investment in that it matches our annual HUD allocation for all HUD funding on a year. It almost matches that. So a little bit about the ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act. It was signed into law March 11th of 2021. That really just gave us the kind of outline of ARP, as we call it, instead of ARPA. And we found out that about $2 trillion in relief was going to be deployed to address the impact of COVID-19. And that included $5 billion in HOME-ARP. At that time, we did not know how much the city would be getting, but we knew that it was out there, and we were hopeful that we would receive some. So about a month later, in April 2021, we found out we were getting approximately $9 million, or $8.98 million from the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. And this is just the HOME-ARP funds. There are some other things associated with that, but again, we're just talking about HOME-ARP today. And at that time in April of 2021, there was not a lot of information shared from HUD or anywhere else on the exact kind of cause or purpose of the funding, only that we knew it was going to be used to address homelessness and folks who are at risk of homelessness. And we knew that partnerships within the community were going to be really, really important. So things we'd been working on over the past couple of years, but we were going to have to continue and expand on. Again, more background. I mentioned this earlier. HOME-ARP is different from the city's annual home allocation. So HOME-ARP, one of the big things that is called out in the regulation and that HUD is really reiterated is that this is focusing on these qualified populations. They're specific and different from what home funding is normally used for. Home funding traditionally targets income levels, and that's about it. I mean, there's some other things in there, but so HOME-ARP is quite different in that it targets qualifying populations. That includes homeless persons and persons who are at risk of homelessness. Those are both HUD definitions, and we'll get into that later. There are also, for HOME-ARP, there are eligible projects and activities that vary from traditional home projects. The city uses home dollars and has for a long time to support affordable housing developments, rental housing, and home buyer programs. We have an annual RFP. We have a lot of great programs funded by HUD and funded by home dollars. And this one, this funding is just a little bit different, and we're real excited about it. There are additional flexibilities from the home regulations within the individual activities or within the individual, program types or projects. So the affordable housing developments supported by HOME-ARP are different from the affordable housing developments supported by HOME, or can be, I should say. So we'll get into that a little bit later on. Getting into a little bit more of kind of how this process came together. So the city of Rochester, Monroe County, and Partners Ending Homelessness, which is the Rochester Monroe County Homeless Continuum of Care, we partnered with planning efforts and to perform outreach to create a plan for the local use of HOME-ARP funds. As I mentioned, we were told about the local money. So the county was told and the city were told in April 2021 about how much we would be getting. And we were told a little bit about qualifying populations, but we were told that, we would need to be working in partnership with some of our local stakeholders, including the County of Monroe and Partners Ending Homelessness. And they've been great partners throughout this process since, the middle of last year. In September of last year, HUD gave us some guidance on how we were supposed to plan, which again is not super unusual for HUD. They usually give guidance on these things, but it was pretty specific on who we needed to interact with and what we needed to get out of those interactions to put a plan together. So again, we were told about the funding in April 2021. In September 2021, we were told how the planning process should go. And one of the big points of the planning process was working with the community and people familiar with these populations to identify gaps in our local community, whether it's gaps in services, gaps in available units, gaps in funding. So again, we'll get into that later, but a little bit more background on HOME-ARP. So quickly going over the HOME-ARP funding allocation plan schedule. That's a mouthful. So I already talked about those first two markers. We were told about the money in April of last year. We received guidance in September on how to go about the planning process and how to use the money long term. And we started planning and outreach in October of 2021. We've done a few, we've tried to be relatively comprehensive in a short amount of time with our outreach and engagement. We knew that consultation meetings with subject matter experts was going to be a part of it. That was required by HUD. But we also wanted to talk to people who are most familiar with the qualifying population. So we released a couple of surveys. The main survey was released in December 2021. We held those consultation meetings I spoke about from January to March of 2022. The draft plan, which is why I assume a lot of you are here, was published a couple of weeks ago on April 4th. This public meeting, input meeting we're holding right now, April 20th. Thank you guys all again for attending. We're having a public hearing on May 5th. And it's being referred for approval, hopefully, or review by Rochester City Council at the May Council meeting. And then after that council meeting and pending council approval, we will submit the plan to HUD and also submit the substantial amendment to our 21-22 annual action plan, which is sort of all part of the process. We're amending our current fiscal year action plan to account for this influx of new money and addition of new projects. So we'll move on to an overview of the planning and outreach effort we've had so far. So again, it started in 2021, and it was, we've been doing this in partnership really with the Monroe County and Partners Ending Homelessness from the beginning, and couldn't have done any of this without them, to tell you the truth. They've been great partners and super supportive. And so we started in 2021. We announced via the city, the county, and Partners Ending Homelessness's contact lists. We also presented on the funding to the Homeless Services Network. For folks who don't know, it's a group of folks who really have their kind of finger on the pulse of unhoused persons who are at risk of homelessness, housing issues in general, housing rights, you name it. There are landlord groups there. It's a real good consortium of folks who are kind of getting together to discuss these matters. So again, we presented on the funding to the Homeless Services Network, and that was done in, I think, November of 2021. Apologies that I don't have the date, but after that, we consulted with the organizations that work with the qualifying populations. Again, we did that January to March of this year, and that was specifically laid out in the guidance materials that HUD released in September 2021. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But so on top of presenting and announcing the funding and consulting with these organizations, we also created and distributed a couple of surveys. The first survey was for housing and service providers, and it was really to collect feedback to get a idea of what the community priorities were and identify what the perceived funding gaps were in the community. We knew that a lot of this would be anecdotal. We asked people to prioritize things and give us, written feedback. There were open-ended questions, but we thought it was really important. We had done this in the past and it was useful, and we wanted to do it again. So we'll talk about that in a minute. The second survey was for persons who are actually residing in emergency shelters, and so we deployed that, but we really didn't receive sufficient feedback for that to be useful. I think we only got a handful of responses. And I think we anticipated that would be difficult because when people are accessing emergency shelters, their first thought might not be to respond to a survey. And for the case managers who are in those shelters and overworked and trying to find solutions for those folks they're serving, it's another burden for them. So we're going to reapproach that, but just wanted to make note of that. We did try that. It didn't work out. We're going to look at it again. Anyways, part of this planning and outreach process was also sort of data analysis and reviewing reports and information that have been produced by a variety of sources locally and, at the state level, the county level, and also at the federal level. So that included things like the point in time count, which is done annually by the Continuum of Care, Partners Ending Homelessness, the Housing Inventory Count, or HIC, and the numerous planning documents created by the city, by local organizations that work in this area. So we tried to be comprehensive in what we were reviewing and what we were taking into consideration. Some other things that we reviewed were the citywide housing market study, the comprehensive plan completed by the city, and things like CHAZ data. So anyways, that's, we don't have to go over any more acronyms, but we tried to be pretty comprehensive in the things we reviewed. So a little bit about the survey. Again, we developed this in partnership with the city, with Monroe County and Partners Ending Homelessness. And we sent this to organizations that work with the qualifying populations. We sent it out on December 22nd of last year, 2021, and we received 84 responses back, which was a pretty good response rate, we thought. We received a variety of types of responses too. We got 27 people from homeless services providers. We also received a handful of responses from healthcare workers, people who work in education, persons associated with the local housing authorities. We received numerous responses just from community members who were interested in this and weren't necessarily associated with any of these organizations. So it was a pretty good, a pretty well-rounded group. We think we got responses from. So again, we got 84 responses, and we asked folks to prioritize things and kind of identify need and tell us what they thought the issues were in our community and where the gaps were. There was one kind of overarching theme in that, the highest priority identified amongst everybody, no matter kind of which part of the community they work in or are attached to, was the development of affordable and appropriate housing units, I should say. So whether that's supportive housing or extremely low income housing, whatever it is, accessible housing, that was really common throughout all of the responses, whether it was the numerical priorities or the anecdotal, the statements at the end of the survey. Again, I mentioned we didn't receive an adequate response to the second survey. One other thing I wanted to mention about the first survey was that there were the second priority, or the second listed priority, was a little bit harder to determine because there were a couple of eligible activities that were sort of all ranked in the same level. Again, the affordable housing units were far and above the highest need by just about everybody that had responded. Not everyone, I won't say that, but by a large portion of folks. And then right behind that was the acquisition and development of non-congregate shelter units, the provision of supportive services, and things like rental assistance. So those all were sort of behind, but equal measure in second. There were some additional comments that, we won't get into. They're very important. We're going to try and include that with the submittals to HUD. So again, if you have more questions on this, please ask. Oh, sorry, folks, going back. Okay. To the next, phase of planning and outreach was the consultation meeting. So we held these in early 2022 with organizations that served the qualifying populations for this funding. And this was something that we were told we needed to do by HUD. They're very specific, but it's something that, we likely would have done anyways, because these are the subject matter experts and these folks really knew the populations and the projects and the need the best. So again, we met with organizations that were serving homeless and unhoused folks and those who were at risk of homelessness or at risk of losing their housing. We spoke with organizations that serve persons fleeing and survivors of domestic violence, and also organizations that work with veterans and families of veterans. We also consulted with local housing agencies, and for the city that included the Rochester Housing Authority, but because we were working with the county, it also included the Fairport Housing Authority. And so we got to see kind of a larger community context too, which I think was useful. And then lastly, we consulted with agencies that addressed fair housing, civil rights, and the needs of persons with disabilities. So I know this is a little bit vague, but again, we spoke to a lot of folks locally, nonprofit housing developers, religious leaders, homeless service providers, victim service providers, civil rights agencies, fair housing agencies, and just about everyone we could get into a room for virtual consultations. There's a summary of those meetings and the kind of overall process in the plan, the draft plan, which you're free to review, please, and we will probably expand on before the final plan is submitted. But again, we were reaching out to these folks to determine, there was a set of questions we had to ask as prescribed by HUD, but we wanted to figure out, what was the perceived need in the community? What type of services did they offer? And where were the gaps that they saw with services, with funding, with housing? Where were the pressure points? And again, I mentioned this earlier, but we also analyzed data from the point in time count, the community housing affordability survey, and a lot of other great sources that were super useful, like the prioritization list, which is a housing wait list for people who are in need of supportive housing or rapid rehousing. So we tried to be, again, I probably said this too much. We tried to be comprehensive in what we reviewed and what we kind of included in the plan. Apologies, folks. So the next slide is for the qualifying populations. So HOME-ARP regulation requires that the majority of the funding be used to support qualifying populations. And we are going to go over this briefly because it can be a little bit detail heavy, but those qualifying populations are persons who meet HUD's definition of homeless, persons who meet HUD's definition of at risk of homelessness, those who are fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, veterans and families of veterans. And then this fourth one, which I saved for last, is a mouthful, but it's part of other populations where providing support services would prevent a family's homelessness or would serve those with the greatest risk of housing instability. And basically what that means is if somebody lives in a housing unit and for whatever reason it has characteristics associated with them losing their housing or being unstable, they would qualify. And when we think about about this, generally what we picture is people who are severely rent burdened and extremely low income, or in overcrowded units, things like that. So we're going to move on from there. I'm not going to go through this entire slide because I think it's pretty detail heavy. We included it so that folks could review it if they missed the meeting or after the fact, but this goes over HUD's definition of homeless. So it's an individual or family who lacks a regular, fixed, or adequate nighttime residence, or somebody who will imminently lose their nighttime residence, which is different from an at-risk definition. And then it also includes categories for youth, persons under 25 years, or families with youth who don't qualify but meet other definitions. And again, that's detail heavy, but you can look in the regulation and the links at the end of the document, or talk to us and we can discuss that more if that's something you're interested in pursuing. Yeah, so again, there's the HUD definition of homelessness. There's a lot of good information on the HUD Exchange about that, or you can please reach out to us if you're curious about that. We're happy to discuss more. The second qualifying population is persons at risk of homelessness. It's an individual or family who has an annual income below 30% of AMI, so an ELI or extremely low income household, who does not have resources to prevent them from moving into a shelter, or to essentially prevent them from becoming homeless, or becoming a household that qualifies under the homeless definition. So they can't kind of pick themselves up and figure, to support or get out of the situation themselves, is what that means. And then they also have to meet one of these third criteria. So for at risk, it's 3 of these, right? It's the first, the second, and then you have to meet one of the third definition. So you've moved 2 or more times during the previous 60 days, you'll lose your housing within 21 days. So just for reference point, this definition is what a lot of the ESG programs and ESG CV funded programs use if they're doing homelessness prevention activities. So some of the work the Tenant Defense Project does has to follow some of this definition, and as well as some of the rental arrears assistance programs. And usually that's, established by showing that an eviction will happen, but there are other ways to do it. And I think those are very important and unique, and it's worth looking at, because I think it's not something that is focused on as much. Everybody looks at evictions, and we don't necessarily look at maybe the overcrowded units or people living in hotels. So anyways, something to think about, part of the qualifying populations. The last 3 definitions that were included in qualifying populations were special populations or other, which is the last one we'll talk about. So again, domestic violence, we talked about this briefly. It's persons or households fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, or human trafficking. Those things are all defined by HUD in the regulation, but it's nothing, I think, that's too far from, what I think your definition of those might be. So moving on to the next one is veterans, and that includes veterans and families that include a veteran family member, but also that meet one of the earlier criteria. And then other, which is, again, people who basically are going to become homeless because of the characteristics of their housing. And we talked on this briefly, but it's, severely rent burdened, ELI, extremely low income households, or people who are in overcrowded units, or things like that. So if you have questions on that, because I think it's kind of an interesting part of the qualifying populations, please reach out and talk to us. Moving past information on qualifying populations, is the HOME-ARP eligible activities. So we already talked about one of the big differences with HOME-ARP funding between that and regular home funding. And this other major difference is the eligible activities, or the projects that can be undertaken with HOME-ARP funding. And there's a little bit of overlap, but some of the detail is where it gets different. So the eligible activities for HOME-ARP funding, it's the development and support of affordable housing, acquisition and development of non-congregate shelter units, the provision of supportive services, tenant-based rental assistance, and nonprofit operating and capacity building assistance. We're going to talk about these briefly after this slide, but if you want more detail and would like to really dig into this stuff, at the end of the presentation, which will be posted on the city website, there are going to be links to the HUD Exchange that have fact sheets on every program type. So that's a really good resource for folks who are interested. So the first eligible activity is development and support of affordable housing. So home ARP funds can be used to acquire, construct, and rehabilitate rental housing for qualifying populations. And one thing that I wanted to mention, because it was sort of learned in response to one of the comments we got since the plan went out, is that home ARP funds cannot be used to support home buyer, existing homeowner assistance, nor for homeownership or owner occupied activities really of any kind. HUD really refocused the purpose of home funds, where in the past we could use it for those types of activities as well as rental housing. And they are strictly kind of using this funding for the eligible projects that were listed on the previous slide. So we did receive a couple of questions when we released the plan about potential kind of down payment or purchase programs, and we looked into that, but it is not, again, just what I mentioned before, the funding cannot be used to support home buyer or homeowner assistance of any kind. Excuse me. The development can include a single family or multifamily rental housing, transitional or permanent housing, group homes, and SRO units. For folks familiar with shelters and permanent housing, the word transitional in there might seem maybe a little out of place, because I think HUD has kind of moved away from that in recent years, but that was called for in the plan. So it's something where, you know, if you're looking into different types of affordable housing, that's a potential model you can look at along with all of the other ones. Earlier in the presentation, we talked about the qualifying populations, and for development of affordable housing units, if a project or development is supported by HOME-ARP, then 70% of the units must be occupied by qualifying populations. The remaining 30% of the units are set aside for low-income households, which according to HUD is 80% AMI or below. But that's sort of to make sure that, I guess, that the developments kind of can pencil out for underwriters and for long-term investments. There's still a lot of flexibility within that 30% to target different AMIs, and even within the qualifying populations to target different household types. So it's not quite as straightforward as this, but this is the targeting at its simplest, I would say, which is, again, that's different from how home funding normally targets AMI levels and targets households. The last one, which I thought was pretty important, was for any affordable housing developments that are supported by HOME-ARP, the households cannot contribute more tthan 30% of their income towards rent. And this may seem strange to have to state, but not every program out there requires this. All of this, the city home funds and the HOME-ARP funds require it. We want to make sure we put people into housing and they aren't, rent burdened from day one. But this is important, and it's something we're making sure we relay to everybody when they're looking at this funding. So again, households will never pay more than 30% of their income on a HOME-ARP unit. Lastly, just with this one, we anticipate that we're going to need to partner with a lot of great, a lot of stakeholders to get these types of projects off the ground. Even though the $9 million sounds like a significant amount of money, and it is, affordable housing developments usually don't get moving unless a lot of people have kind of signed on or agreed or participated in the development of some kind. And I'm not talking about just funders, but even locally, nonprofit developers must partner with housing service providers, which they'll talk to the city and the county and the state to put together a funding package. So we know we're going to need to work with our other partners, our funding partners, and our community stakeholders to get these going. And that's our plan. We want to see innovative, unique proposals. Hopefully we will have a bigger influence on the types of developments because the larger amount of money and because of the flexibilities we're given. But anyways, we understand that this is going to be a partnership, and we anticipate that and welcome it. So the next eligible activity is the acquisition and development of non-congregate shelter units. This was, just so everybody knows, the reason why development of affordable housing and acquisition and development of non-congregate shelter units are 1 and 2 is because they're listed as the highest priority, and anybody who looked at the plan and saw the breakdown of funding could ascertain that they have the most amount of funding in the draft funding plan, and They're also, I think, two of the more kind of unique projects that we're able to fund with HOME-ARP. So again, HOME-ARP funds can be used to acquire and develop non-congregate shelter units for the qualifying populations. I want to make sure I stick that in there. It provides private units or rooms as temporary shelter to individuals and families. And what temporary means is, there's not a lease. They're not required to sign anything or pay, agree to pay a rent, things like that. So it's a shelter, but they have their own space. What's required to be within that space is relatively specific, but there's some flexibility there. So that's all in the regulation. I don't want to go into that now, but this type of development or project can include construction of new structures or the acquisition and rehab of existing structures. And when I say existing structures, I mean, motels, hotels, nursing homes. Think of, buildings you've seen turned into affordable housing in the past. Even existing shelters that maybe are not set up the way that the current shelter management wants to be operating and sees an opportunity there. That's an option. We can rehab an existing shelter into a non-congregate shelter. So there's a lot of options there. Again, acquisition and rehab are really the big ones. HOME-ARP cannot be used to pay for the ongoing operating costs, which is a big one. Operating a shelter is not cheap. Operating in a non-congregate shelter is not inexpensive. There are many sources out there to pay for these types of operations, but part of any proposals we view for this type of development, it's going to require kind of a long-term feasibility plan. So we'll work with folks on that. It's something we anticipate and we're thinking about already. And then the last point is that the NCS non-congregate shelter units can be converted to permanent, affordable, or supportive housing at the end of a restricted use period, which is 10 to 15 years, depending on the type of development. That's not something we're really looking into specifically right now, but it's an option for people looking at long-term viability of projects, or if they have a long-term plan of some kind that they want to consider. Anyhow, moving on to the third third, fourth, and fifth eligible project types. We've got supportive services, tenant-based rental assistance, and operating and capacity building assistance. So for supportive services, it's pretty wide-reaching. It includes things like housing counseling services, job training, legal services, homelessness and eviction prevention, case management, things like moving costs. It's as long as they serve one of the qualifying populations, there's a lot of options there, I would say. And folks who are familiar with some of the things we fund with CDBG or ESG Cares Act or CDBG Cares Act might be familiar with these types of projects. It's things we've done in the past, case management that's attached to specific housing developments, things like that. So there are some options there. The next is tenant-based rental assistance, and this includes payments towards housing and housing-related costs, which include rent, security deposits, utility deposits, and utility costs. So that's pretty straightforward. One of the unique things about TBRA with HOME-ARP is that it travels. So it is not associated with a project, but it's associated with the household. So that's really the main differentiator that we all saw with this project type, but it is unique because it's not super common to find that. So the last project type eligible activity is operating and capacity building assistance. We put these together. They seem pretty well linked in most of our eyes, but they can be separate. So up to 5% of the city's allocation of HOME-ARP can be used to pay operating expenses for community housing development organizations, or CHODOs, and other nonprofits that are going to carry out activities with HOME-ARP funds. So folks who are going to help deploy HOME-ARP funds by, providing rental assistance or supportive services or developing a non-congregate shelter. they could be eligible for this type of assistance. And again, with capacity building assistance, it's very similar. Up to 5% of the city's allocation can be used to develop the capacity of organizations that are going to carry out activities with HOME-ARP funds. That's pretty straightforward, I think. But again, questions about that, please make sure you're entering all questions. I'm going to harp on this again. All questions and comments, guys, please, in the Q&A section. So thanks, everyone. Almost done, I promise, and then you don't have to hear me talk as much. Okay, we're moving on to the draft HOME-ARP funding allocation plan. And this was sort of the crux of all of that work and all of that information you saw before this slide, I suppose. And this is how the city decided to split the funding allocation between the different activities. And you can see here that the majority or a large part of the funding goes towards the development and support of affordable housing, 35% actually, and 20% goes towards the acquisition and development of non-congregate shelter units. We do have some funds in provision of support services, tenant-based rental assistance, and nonprofit capacity building assistance, and also for administration and planning. But again, the total allocation is 8.98 million. And what I wanted to mention is that the amounts dedicated to each of these project types can and likely will shift. Because we've received more comments and information since we put out the draft plan than I think maybe I anticipated, and we've received additional data and just more feedback. So I think that's a reason for change in itself. Also, further down the road, kind of amounts can change if new programs or projects or priorities come to light. So that requires a lot of work down the road. But I did want to mention that this is the draft allocation plan, and the percentages can change a little bit. And I wanted to mention a couple of things about this funding plan and how it was established. I think we talked a little bit about that, but I mean, we tried to review the city along with the county and the continuum of care, our Partners Ending Homelessness. We tried to review as many pieces of information or data points as we could to put this together. That included information we got from the surveys, from our consultation virtual sessions, from all of the experts in the field. A lot of that information was conversational and anecdotal, but we did receive a good amount of data too. We also reviewed, we did a data analysis on point in time housing inventory count, community housing affordability survey, or CHAZ, and we looked at the city's own planning documents, including the annual action plan and the things like the citywide housing market study. So we tried to look at as many things as we could, but also listen to the community. We can't have one without the other. And lastly, the one other thing we had to take into account, as directed by HUD, was we needed to perform a review of some of the other funding that our community has received in the past couple of years. Has there been other resources for these activities? Is there still funding available for these activities? So it's really there's a lot of different kind of levers you have to flip to, I guess, to come to a conclusion on any one of these eligible activities. It's information from the experts, it's the data, but it's also looking at existing funding, past funding, and likely future funding, and then also where the need is. So I think we are going to end it there so you guys can ask questions. The one thing I guess I'll close with is with this plan, again, it's a draft plan, and we anticipate that we're going to continue working with the community to, after the plan is even submitted to HUD, to come up with the best projects and programs we can. Everything's going to be done via RFP or RFQ or NOFA. We're going to solicit feedback and information from the community about what their proposals for this funding. So we provide sort of the guidelines and the framework for this funding, and we rely on the community to help us kind of direct the actual individual investments. Again, we will work with them on that, and the county and Partners Ending Homelessness and everybody else we can, but I wanted to make sure that was out there. And lastly, as with respect to the breakdown of funds between the different types of activities, one of the things that the city has kind of kept in mind throughout this, and kind of, I think, was further cemented by the feedback we received, was, our own housing policy, but the fact that we wanted this funding to have a long lasting and long standing impact on our community, and how, what was the best way to do that. We get some direction from HUD related to, they clearly want us to create units, but even with our own local policy, using a housing first approach and looking at, how do we help these populations the most? I think most of what we heard and what we kind of thought going into it, but again, what we heard from the community was that the best way to help people with housing is to make sure they have affordable, safe, accessible housing. So I think that sort of is the overarching theme for us, but I'm gonna stop talking for a little bit. And I know there's been some questions submitted and some answers given. And if we have others we need to answer now, we will do that. So I'm gonna exit out of the presentation now. Oh, sorry, before I do that, I did want to show these last slides. So there is, if you want more information and information on next steps, we are going to post, you can contact Henry Fitz. He's our jack of all trades, but he helps with this presentation. He helps with all of our funding, and really is kind of the go-to guy if you want to know more about this funding or the plans for the allocation plan itself, our process with council, whatever it is, he's a good resource. You can also, so that email would be hudfunding@cityofrochester.gov. You can email him. And then the PowerPoint, as we mentioned, is going to be uploaded to this website, cityofrochester.gov/consolidated plan 2020. That'll happen in the next day or two. It's going to take us a day or two, folks, but we promise we'll do it. And then there is, information on the next meetings we had earlier in the presentation, but I've posted that online, and you can find that on the website. So this last slide isn't going to do much good here, but when you find the presentation online, there are links to the HUD HOME-ARP page, which has some really good resources and documents. There's implementation notices, basically sort of one-pagers on every single program type, which are very useful, and other information depending on how far into the weeds you want to get. So that's it for the presentation. Again, we ask that folks, anybody who has a question, please type it into the Q&A, and we will make sure we get to everybody, or as many as we can here. Thanks everyone again for listening, and I appreciate the feedback you've given thus far, and that I know we're going to continue to get. Thanks.
Hi, this is Linda Hedden. What I'd like to do now, I think, is go through the questions that appeared in the chat. There are a couple that there were not responses to, and I will hope that perhaps some of our colleagues on this meeting will be able to expand on those. Starting with how many people are homeless in Rochester? At present, the current number is 815 persons identified as homeless, according to the Partners Ending Homelessness website. The next question was that person received a copy, does not have page 13 refinancing information completed. Is there a subsequent document? Response to that was, please provide additional information. The same person identified the substantial amendment to the city's consolidated plan that was on the city's website, and the response to that was that at this point there had been no changes to the draft funding allocation plan included in the document. If that is not the response to the question, please provide an updated question. We'll try and get to your answer. Wasn't quite sure how to respond to that. Next was the Tenant Purchase Assistance Program. I'm guessing was included in this plan. The city will be undertaking requests for proposals for specific activities, programs, or projects to be implemented with HOME-ARP funding in the near future. Next question relates to the first question that we had regarding the document and the page. After that, there was a question about in the plan, requested clarification of that question, didn't see a response. There was also a statement about sanctions saying that this is one of the root causes to the problem of homelessness, and requested additional information. Next question, when speaking about eligible activities, John refers to families. Can the target population also be singles? Response, yes, it's common to use references to families, households, and/or single persons when discussing vulnerable populations as any size household, including single persons, or a family may be at risk of homelessness. What is the AMI dollar amount that is being used? These funds can be used to assist households with income of up to 80% AMI. However, the focus for these funds will be directed to assist those households that are extremely low income. Follow-up question, what is the amount of AMI? 80% AMI. For one person, that amount is currently $44,950. For a four-person household, 80% AMI is $64,150. There are a couple of questions that remain open. One is, who decides the HOME-ARP funding allocation plan? Need to see who is making the decision.
I'll respond to that. I don't think one person decides the HOME-ARP funding allocation plan. This was a joint effort, the planning effort between the city, the county, and Partners Ending Homelessness. And also, we put this out there so that kind of everybody has an impact on the decision. The comments and input we received today will impact the final plan. And lastly, this does go to council for review in May. So several people participate and ultimately sign off on it. And then after we submit it to HUD, they get to tell us if it's good or not as well. So several people review the plan after everything as well.
The next question, which doesn't yet have a response provided, but is, can you tell us how the HOME-ARP funds can fund the city's successful tenant emergency repair program, which is a revolving loan that repairs for tenants who have negligent landlords who cause immediate health hazards, which if not fixed could lead to displacement. The landlord is billed for the renovations and the city is paid back for repairs. The response to that is requests for proposals will be issued to determine programs and projects to be funded with HOME-ARP. Sending that. We have another question. Who are the administration and planning people? Who are the nonprofit groups? They appear to take 1/3 of the budget.
Okay, sorry. The administration and planning people, who are the nonprofit groups. So as part of the funding allocation plan, up to 15% of the total allocation can be used to pay for administration and planning. And that means the city's costs, but also costs of agencies that we contract with during the planning and administration phase. So that's 15%, up to 15%. And then there were, and I think you might be referring to this part as well, the the capacity building and the operating assistance, which can be up to 5%. And as far as who are those nonprofits, we haven't chosen them yet. And the reason for that is because those groups can receive that type of funding, the operating capacity building assistance, if they are chosen to deploy HOME-ARP funds through other programs. So that was kind of confusing even for me. But if we choose somebody to be our tenant-based rental, to deploy tenant-based rental assistance for us, and they need additional operating assistance or capacity building like training to be able to do that, then they can access those funds.
Thank you, John. Next question, can you elaborate on the 3 million plus for development and support of affordable housing and how it will be allocated? Is this new construction? I can take a swing at this one. Development and support of affordable housing, the funds typically are allocated based on a request for proposals process. It could be for the new construction of housing, or it could be for the adapted reuse or rehabilitation of existing housing for the purposes of providing housing, permanent housing for vulnerable populations. Does anybody else in the city team want to elaborate on that? All right. Next question, what is the 30% AMI number? I've got one person household is $16,850, four-person household is $24,050. I'm seeing that there. I have a question, what is the role of faith-based entities, if any, with this funding? Looking for a response from my colleagues.
So when we did the consultation process in January, February, and March of this year, one of the meetings we held was with religious or faith-based leaders and the leadership locally. We received their feedback about the community. Some of them operate programs that serve the community. Some of them have community development organizations. Sorry, I hear something coming through. But so anyways, we solicited their feedback to develop the plan. And we imagine they will continue to be a part of it when we issue RFPs or are looking for partners to either develop housing or perform services.
Next question is, will the public be given a breakdown of how this money is being used? And a second question, why in the last 2 years do we no longer have affordable housing in Rochester?
Linda, can you repeat that first question?
First question, can you hear me? Is will the public be given a breakdown of how this money is being used?
Yes, yeah. We understand that this chart is not super specific. We had to identify the project types. That's what HUD asked us to do, and we needed to do it in a relatively timely manner. We plan to, everything that we fund with these dollars ultimately will be, applied for through an RFP process, and it'll also be reviewed and hopefully approved or changed or something by city council. So it is a very public process. As far as once the spending has happened, some kind of report or data about the number of units produced or the impact it's had, we also do that annually through our regular reporting. So we will try to be, we will be as transparent as possible.
Second question, why in the last 2 years do we no longer have affordable housing in Rochester?
I think that is a really difficult question. Carol, I think you were trying to comment, but it sounds like your microphone maybe a little bit is not working. So anyways, yes, this is the really challenging question. Where has the affordable housing gone? And I think part of the reason we want to create affordable units with this money is because we've seen the challenges people have in accessing and finding and also securing affordable housing. It's not just finding the units, it's qualifying for the units, and we understand that, and that's why a lot of the push so far, I think so far what we've put 35% of the funding in the draft plan is for the creation of affordable units, which will be truly affordable in that nobody's going to pay more than 30% of their income towards rent. So we hear that concern, and I think we're hoping to respond to that with this funding.
And I do want to add that as far as affordable housing, I mean, the city on an annual basis always invest in affordable housing development. The other piece to this is not only do we have to invest in affordable housing development, but we also need to invest to help ensure that we help to raise people out of poverty. More often than not, we have a poverty issue. And so we have to be doing both, helping on the poverty platform, but also making sure that we increase the number of affordable housing units.
Linda,
Thank you. The
before
next
we go to
question.
Linda, before we go to the next question, I'm getting a request just to repeat the AMI dollar figures again. So for 30% AMI and a one-person household, they would be able to make a maximum of $16,850. For a four-person household at 30% AMI, there'd be a maximum income of $24,050.
And I did just want to add, because I see Thomas's question, the AMI of persons within the city versus the area wide. We at the city and most folks involved, I think with this type of work, understand that the incomes within the city are lower than that of the overall area. Good or not, HUD asks us to use the AMI of the overall community, right? Those area wide. So one of the reasons recently in recent years we've pushed for 30% AMI units is because that's more in line with median incomes in the city. 30% AMI of I don't want to get too into it, but anyways, we understand that there's lower incomes within the city, and that's why we've pushed in the past, and we will continue to push for lower income, extremely low income units.
Next question is, there were percentages already established for ARP funding allocation. Who or what group decided this? The question was not answered last time.
Carol, do you want to take a stab at that? I did try to answer that before, but was unclear.
Okay, sure. So you're saying who decides the income percentages?
No, he was asking the split between the different project types, the eligible project types and the allocation plan. How are those percentages established?
It was really based upon a combination of things. I mean, the information that we received from many of our stakeholders, and particularly when it came down to, all right, what are the highest priorities for these funding or for this funding? And what we do know as far as what is the highest priority, or it appears, is definitely developing permanent housing and permanent supportive housing. those were really the highest priorities that was gathered from different stakeholders, number one. And in addition to that, as far as what are the other percentages, those percentages were prescribed by HUD. But other than that, it was really based upon the information that we received from stakeholders and other comments that have received up until this point. As well as, and I think John had alluded to this, is that just besides, let's say, the information that we have received from stakeholders, there has been other plans and studies that had very good data included. So we really were looking to take in consideration all the resources and tools that we had to come up with a reasonable plan or reasonable percentages for each of those activities.
Thank you. It appears we kind of skipped over one question. I'll go back to it. Can there be grants and programming to help help local private property owners provide affordable housing instead of strictly developers? The Rochester Housing Coalition has some proposals that we believe would effectively engage the private property owners. And then there's a link to their solutions.
Yeah, I believe that what we would want to do, and what has been stated, is that we will have, RFPs, RFQs, or NOFAs, and we do encourage anyone who believe that they can meet the criteria of those RFPs to apply. But we have not made any definitive decisions on any programs or projects at this moment, and do want to make sure that we hear from, or at least review, I guess, the proposals that do come in, and make the best decisions on what will have I believe, the most lasting impact for these funds that we are receiving. Because if you heard the statements at the beginning, one of the things that we know is that this is a one-time investment. This is a one-time opportunity, and we do want to make sure that we're making the best possible decision for sustainable and lasting impact. And I'm pretty certain that when we put together the RFPs, that will be one of the criteria.
And Carol, I'll add to that, just I think one piece of the confusion may be that part of the terminology that HUD uses in HUD planning documents and our annual action plan, it refers to projects listed in the annual action plan, where those projects may actually be something that's more like a program, or more like a fund for affordable housing development. So that terminology can be confusing for the public when we say, these are the 6 projects we're establishing under HOME-ARP, but really they're more just buckets of funding that we will then, further on go into an RFP process.
Thank you, Henry.
Thank you, Henry.
The next question or comment is, there is no reference I found in the plan that includes seniors, and particularly seniors with age-related disabilities, as a target population at risk of homelessness. I'd like to have an opportunity to raise a consideration of evaluating the risks to seniors of homelessness and the regular undercounting of this subpopulation. This would be difficult to write into this box. Can I raise my hand and explain instead?
So the comment is making sure that we consider the senior population?
With age-related disabilities, concern that those folks are at risk of homelessness, and that there is regular undercounting of this subpopulation.
I wanted to comment on this because I think this is I saw this comment, this question, and I thought it was pretty interesting. I apologize. I don't know if we can actually switch it during the meeting to have you raise your hand and ask the question, but I would like to talk to you about this because earlier in the plan, one of the things we mentioned was with qualifying populations, and I think you might have noticed this. If we can prove that housing characteristics are more likely to lead to a household's homelessness, experiencing homelessness, or becoming at risk of homelessness, if we have the data there, then it can be considered a qualifying population. So I think that's what you're maybe mentioning, and the fact that perhaps in past data, it hasn't done justice maybe to how severe this issue might be. So I would like to talk to you more about this. I think that's an interesting subpopulation to look at. So I can't say yes or no, but I'd say it's a possibility.
There was an additional set of information from the same person. The definition of homeless and at risk of homelessness excludes seniors, and specifically seniors with disabilities, because they generally will not say that they have no one with whom they can stay, but they cannot safely couch surf or go to shelters. Common Ground Health determined that seniors of color in Rochester generally live in multi-generational housing, often without sufficient supports. No bedrooms or bathrooms on the ground floor, often home alone because of family away at work. This is a specific need for a certain type of housing. I have other details. So I think that loops into what John was saying, that he's interested in having additional discussion with specifics. One comment I can make is that the city of Rochester has and continues to try and partner with affordable housing developers that are looking to provide affordable housing for the senior population, and that there are specific funding sources to provide supportive housing for folks who are defined as frail elderly, which may kind of cover that. Certainly there may be more people or households that need this type of assistance than we have been able to take advantage of so far, but we're certainly open to and interested in, and likely to be able to continue to find those partnerships and include these other sources of funding to make it possible to have rental communities where seniors can be safe and where they can receive the services that they need to age in the community.
I will offer, Linda, I'll offer to connect Lisa Reagan with John and others in the housing team to facilitate additional conversation. I know she's passionate on the topic. So
that would be great. Thank you, Eric. The next question: the city issues RFPs to determine projects, or the RFPs related to already determined projects? I think what we heard a little bit earlier was that this is still a developing process, and that, as mentioned before, the RFPs will be identified for either particular types of activities or programs, or notices of funding opportunities where there may be opportunities for folks who have these type of ideas to submit information and propose how they might be able to address the needs that they've identified in the manner in which they believe that they could be successful assisting these vulnerable populations. Anybody else on the team care to expand on that or correct me if I'm off base?
Yeah, I would just say, yeah, keep an eye out, because I think depending even on the program type, it could be that we design, the framework of a program and ask people to apply for that, or it's more general in nature. So yeah, I think in most cases we don't have a specific project in mind, more just the framework for what we want to see developed or given to the community, the program.
Next question is, how would someone recommend a grant program to use the funds for? My hope is that, as we've recently said, that there would be opportunities to respond to requests for proposals, as well as notices of funding availability that may be forthcoming.
So if someone wants to recommend a grant program to use funds for, I mean, you can do it right in the Q&A now. You can also send it to that email. We've received a couple of emails from folks prior to this meeting that actually got us thinking about some new potential projects or programs. So please send us an email. Henry, if you could relay what that email address is again, I apologize, I forgot it. But yeah, if you could send us a notice to that email, we can get back to you with more information.
Great, thank you. Next, we have for our information, Lifespan published a document titled Poverty in Later Life that may give some solid information. That certainly sounds like a really useful tool. Thank you for suggesting it. Next, the senior population should be in their home neighborhoods to avoid disruptions later in life that cause dementia with moves away from family and familiar, I'm going to say environment is my guess. Yes, we're aware of that, and we would be looking to do that. A project that has recently completed construction, Zion Hill Senior Apartments, is located in the southwest area of the city of Rochester. And it was proposed by the Zion Hill Church and their not-for-profit housing development entity, and they partnered with Rochester Management Incorporated to develop 45 apartments for seniors, including some with assisted supportive services, with that thought in mind that it is important for seniors to be able to age in their communities in housing that will meet their needs. So thank you for that. The last question on the list so far is, have you picked locations yet?
No.
Yeah, so, oh, sorry, Carol, I heard you, but
Oh, no, go ahead.
no, we have not picked locations. I think you're maybe referring specifically to the affordable housing units or the non-congregate shelter units. We haven't. We are very much still in the planning stages, and we will not pick locations until we've gone through, an RFP process or done quite a bit more work to identify maybe the locations and projects that make the most sense.
Just a reminder to all that you can send additional comments, questions, or ideas to hudfunding@cityofrochester.gov if you have more to offer. We do have one additional question that came in. Many of Rochester's largest developers are telling churches and residents that the development of 30% AMI is not possible in Rochester. Can you speak to this misinformation?
Yeah, so what I will say is that making housing developments, creating them with units that serve households earning 30% AMI below is possible, but it's challenging with existing affordable housing finance processes. The city has attempted to get more 30% AMI units in developments in recent years and has been successful. We do that by leveraging state programs that provide rental subsidies or additional capital for construction. And one of our hopes with this funding, with HOME-ARP, is to have more of an impact like that. So I would say it's challenging. It is not impossible.
And we have a response. Thank you for clarifying that. Are there any other questions folks want to put into the Q&A?
Linda, I did want to just comment on one of the questions that was answered with respect to it was Ms. Reagan. The copy I have reviewed does not have the page related to refinancing information. So the reason for that is because the city is not going to pursue that as an eligible activity or eligible use of funds at this time. What it means in this format is, are we going to refinance existing debt on an affordable housing development in some way, usually to extend affordability, period. And as of right now, we do not have that as a anticipated use of the funding.
We seem to have one last question. What is the timeline for this process? Not sure if it's
So short term, in the next month or so, the plan will be final. And when I say final, I mean in the form where we can submit it to the final version to City Council for review, hopefully get their approval, and then submit the plan and the substantial amendment to HUD. That'll all hopefully happen in May of this year. After that, we anticipate in the next several months releasing RFPs for some, if not all of the eligible project types. We have considered combining the affordable housing RFP or the affordable housing units to be funded by this money with our annual process that we have for regular home dollars, so we can leverage additional resources and combine funds. But we don't have a specific set timeline for when all of those will be released. We know that we will be releasing RFPs in the coming months. And what I will say is that in general, we have to spend all of this money by 2030. And we anticipate spending it well before that, but we do, that is the only other date I think that HUD provided us with that might be of concern to you.
And I'll just say, if you are not already on our HUD email list, please email me at that address. Again, it's hudfunding@cityofrochester.gov, and I'll add you to our email list, and that email list will receive notifications about all of the RFPs as they get released, and other additional public meetings and things like this event tonight.
does not appear that there are any additional questions that have been put into the Q&A. Yes, we can say, last call. If you do have a question, please type it into the Q&A.
Seeing none, I'd like to thank everybody for their work on the presentation, Carol and John and Linda for the responses, and to everybody for attending and for the excellent conversation that we had. I'll turn it back to Carol or John for any last comments before we sign off.
Carol, I think your microphone might be having issues, but I know she would thank all of you profusely and appreciate your input. And say stay tuned for the next steps. And please reach out if you have anything more to ask or say. Thank you.